And joining us now to discuss President Biden's legacy and the historic nature of this day where President Biden has decided not to seek re-election, we have presidential historian Jane Hampton Cook. Jane, so great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Jane, tell us, what were your initial thoughts when you saw this news today, President Biden's statement, and just how unprecedented is this?
Well, I really initially thought about Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was president in 1968. He announced to the American people that he was not going to run for re-election, and that was in March of that year. And then within days, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and within 2 months, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And so it was a very tumultuous time. And I look at what we've seen here as sort of a smash up between LBJ's decision to withdraw and not continue his race, and Woodrow Wilson, who was another Democratic president, but he had a stroke 17 months before the end of his term, and his wife and doctor hid it from the American people and the media and even from the cabinet. And so we've seen kind of a mixture of health reasons like Wilson, but then also political realities like Lyndon Johnson.
And Lyndon Johnson's successor was Richard Nixon. Some people drawing contrasts to Nixon's when discussing President Biden's potential legacy. When you think of somebody like Richard Nixon, no matter how great or how many accomplishments he may have had, you simply your mind oftentimes just goes to Watergate. What do you think President Biden's legacy will be?
Well, I think it's certainly a number of the things in the piece that you just ran. But, I think inflation, especially if inflation seems to be a deciding issue in this election, a lot of the government spending that Biden did has led to this inflation, is what a lot of economists argue. I think he'll be remembered, too, for the vaccine mandate. It wasn't just encouraging vaccines, it was mandating it. And that crossed the line for a number of Americans and their civil liberties. He got rid of the Keystone Pipeline on the first day in office, and that killed a number of great jobs for the Midwest and in Arkansas and places like that. And so the policies that Biden has, pushed forward are the things that are going to still be part of the legacy that Kamala Harris, if she's the new nominee, has to defend. And so the whole policy package is something that's going to still be relevant in this election, even with him not at the top of the ticket.
And do you think the nature of his exit, the way that it kind of came down in terms of all the pressure and then him having COVID and just all of the factors will kind of overshadow his legacy?
I think that debate may very well overshadow it, because I don't think we have ever seen a debate that has had more impact than the debate between Donald Trump and Biden at the end of June. I've never seen a debate ultimately lead to a candidate withdrawing from the race in the presidency. You've just not seen that before. So this has been a really decisive month. In the past, 4 weeks, we've seen tremendous change on both sides of, with both political parties. And so it's definitely, it could overshadow his legacy for sure.
And you mentioned when we were talking about his legacy just a moment ago, the vaccine mandates. It's really hard the vaccine mandates and the mask mandates, that seems like so many lifetimes ago. It doesn't really feel that it was still within this 4-year term of him being president. With that said, thinking back to January 6th, 2021, a lot of people said Trump is done. How do you put that into context?
Well, I think the fact that we've seen a cognitive decline with Joe Biden, I think that will be talked about a lot, because when Woodrow Wilson was ill in 1919, we didn't have instant news. We didn't have television yet. And they were able to hide his illness. And I think a lot more may come out about just his really the status of his health and what was done to try to conceal that as best as they could from the public. And we've seen a deterioration. And I think that really, in this day and age, really opens up a question: what do you do when a president's health declines? When is the right place to withdraw, either from the next election? And, Republicans right now are suggesting that he resign from the presidency. And that would probably actually help Kamala Harris if he did that. But if his health is too weak to run, is it too weak to remain in office as president? And I think that's a valid question that historians will be debating, I think, in the future.
And I think it's often hard when we live in the present. There's obviously emotion, human emotion attached to the way that we look at things. So if we could just kind of look at this in the broader context of U.S. presidential history, how do you think that Joe Biden's presidency will fit in?
I think he'll be looked at as the career politician, and that what that came to mean in the past century. Because, initially the founders intended for someone to serve as, a governor, a congressman, a member of the Senate and president, and then go back, to their civilian life. And this is really the culmination of 50 years of service, which is laudable in many ways, but also just raises questions. Do we really want career politicians? Or, as the Republicans have seemed to indicate, maybe we do want someone outside the system. And I think that debate is going to also shape the way people look at President Biden's legacy.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions, I think, on both sides where you have, the issue of term limits, and when you have career politicians whose net worth tends to multiply in such a way that most public servants don't see, it certainly raises questions for sure. With that said, what lessons can future political leaders, in your opinion, learn from President Biden's decision to step down?
I think that they can, look at President Biden's decision and think of it as laudable, that he did what was really in the best interest of his party, that he didn't let it get to the point where Speaker Pelosi, former President Obama, that they were not publicly calling for him to leave. They were hinting at it, but they weren't tearing him down in the process, at least not in public. And I think he showed that he accepted reality and decided to make this difficult decision, which, he had wanted to be president for his whole career, and to finally get here and then to not really be able to, for health reasons, seek that second term was very difficult. But I think it will be looked upon favorably. Maybe it should have been done, a few months earlier. But I think that, he had historians surrounding him in the first days of his presidency, advising him. And so that will probably be to his benefit, in the long run, in terms of shaping his presidency.
And do you think that President Biden will ultimately fade into the background, or will he try to stay relevant? And which direction do you see being best for his legacy?
I think we just don't know fully what's going on with his health. And if his health is really fading, he might just fade. Because if he doesn't have the stamina and the strength to continue to be in the limelight, and I think he also will want to let Kamala Harris take over that limelight. And, like President George W. Bush, when he left office, he didn't talk. He was very receded from the public. And a lot of presidents choose to do that because they want their successor to have the opportunity to shine and to be seen as the leader. And so I would think that he would follow that example of others who have gone before him. And, he's passed the torch. He's passed the baton to his Vice President, Kamala Harris.
And in terms of history and legacy, we do see that his vice presidential choice was an historic choice. How do you see that factoring into history, as well as now her being at the top of the ticket?
Well, I think a lot of it will depend on what happens with the election and who comes out on top. But you can't take anything away from the fact that she was the first Black woman to become vice president, and she may be the first Black woman to become an Asian woman to become president. And certainly, if someone else maybe becomes the nominee, she could step in and finish out President Biden's term and give her that place in history, regardless of what happens in November. So I could see that happening as a possibility as well.
Now, there's a lot of potential candidates being floated outside of Kamala Harris. There's that discussion. There's also the discussion of who she may choose to be her vice presidential pick. A lot of these really potential good Democratic candidates to run on the top of the ticket aren't being talked about in the vice president to be a potential vice president because of their gender. Gretchen Whitmer, Michelle Obama. What do you make of this whole, I guess, palace intrigue of who's next and what's next?
Well, I think that if I were Kamala Harris, if I were the vice president, I would be looking at the electoral map and I would choose a vice presidential nominee who could help me win a really critical state. Whether that is Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, whether it's Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, although I think she said that she's not interested at this point. That's what I would think she would do, is to place someone on the ticket who's in a leadership position, who's been elected to office, but who can help bring in valuable electoral votes, because we're so far into the season of the election, and I think that that would be prudent on her part.
What do you make of the likelihood of having two females on the ticket?
Well, I think that's a possibility. I'm not sure that it's likely, but it is feasible. I mean, the Democratic Party is much more focused on things like symbolism and, putting forward the first, in terms of racial politics. Identity politics is very much an important part of the Democratic base, less so with the Republicans. And I think a lot of their constituency is the category of women. And so, I wouldn't ignore that could, be a possibility. I think that is a possibility. I'm not sure it's a likelihood, but I could see that might be some pizzazz to the ticket that's definitely historic to
Just
women on the ticket.
One last quick question out of curiosity. We know that former President Barack Obama cannot run for president because he's fulfilled his 2 terms, but could he potentially be a vice president?
I would not think so, because of the possibility of him stepping into the presidency. I think that would be dicey. I think it would be more likely that he would want to put forward Michelle Obama into the ticket somehow, rather than him personally taking that vice presidential role. It's really hard for a president to step back and be the vice president. I think that would be a difficult thing to pull off. So,
Jane Hampton Cook, thank you so much for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.